In the mid-1990s, archaeologists were carefully working at a site in Birka, Sweden. Well, Birka was a major trading town during the Viking Age. They were excavating a burial ground. One grave from the 10th century held something that stopped them. It was the skeleton of a child. The bones belonged to a boy around 10 years old. A life cut short, which was common, but as they examined the remains, they saw something else. The child's arm had been broken. It was a serious fracture, and it had healed. It had not healed perfectly straight, but it had mended completely. The bone had knitted itself back together. This was not a quick or easy process. For that bone to heal, the boy would have needed care. He would have been unable to work or contribute much for weeks, maybe months. Someone had to set the bone, or at least bind it. Someone had to feed him, keep him safe, and help him while he was vulnerable. He was not discarded. He was not left to fend for himself. In a world we often think of as relentlessly brutal, a family took the time and spent the resources to nurse an injured child back to health. He survived the injury. He eventually died of some other cause, like so many did, but that healed bone tells a story. It speaks of a harsh reality where a 10-year-old could suffer a severe injury, and it speaks of a human reality where a child was still a child worthy of care and love. The heartbreak is not just in the hardness of their lives, but in the humanity that fought against it, often in vain. Number 15, you were named only if you were deemed worthy of life. Her name was Asfrider, but for the first 9 days of her life, she had no name. She was just the child. She was born in the deep of winter in a longhouse near the coast of Norway around the year 875. The wind howled outside, a constant low moan that seemed to seep through the timber walls. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from the central hearth. Her mother, Gunhild, was weak from the birth. Her father, Einar, looked at her with a heavy gaze. He was not unkind, but he was practical. A winter mouth was another mouth to feed from dwindling stores. The first few days were a trial. The cold was a physical presence in the longhouse. Asfrider was swaddled in wool and rabbit fur, but the chill was relentless. She cried often, a thin, reedy sound that was easily lost in the noise of the house. Gunhild held her close, sharing her own body heat, murmuring words of encouragement, not to the baby, but to the fates. Each sunrise was a small victory. Einar would check on her, his large, calloused hand hovering over her tiny face to feel for the wisp of her breath. He looked for signs, was she strong? Did she feed well? Did she have the spirit to survive? This was not cold-heartedness. It was a brutal necessity born from experience. He had seen other infants fade in their first week. He had seen the grief it caused to become attached to a life that was too fragile for this world. There was a practice known as Bera Utbarn, or exposing a child. It was the father's right. If a child was born with a deformity or seemed sickly, or if the family simply could not afford another person, the infant could be taken out and left in the wilderness. It was a grim choice, a surrender to the harsh realities of their world. It was considered better than watching a child starve slowly over the winter. Every family knew of this. Every father carried this weight. Einar looked at his daughter. She was small, but her lungs seemed strong. Her grip was surprisingly firm on his finger. On the 9th day, the decision was made. She would live. She was worthy. Einar took a small wooden cup and filled it with water. He sprinkled the water over her head. This was the Osavatni, the naming ceremony. It was a pre-Christian rite, a formal acceptance of the child into the family and the community. He spoke her name for the first time. Asfrider, he said, the sound of it solid and real in the smoky air. The name meant God beautiful. It was a hope, a prayer for her future. By giving her a name, Einar had taken responsibility for her. He had declared to the gods and his kin that she was one of them. She now had legal standing. If someone were to harm her, they would have to pay a price. She was no longer just a creature, but a person. The relief in the longhouse was palpable. Gunhild wept, not from sorrow, but from the release of 9 days of tension. Her older brother, a boy of 6 named Haldor, was finally allowed to touch her. He peered into the bundle of furs and saw his sister's face for the first time as a person, as Asfrider. But the heartbreaking reality lingered in the air, unspoken. The choice. The fact that her existence had been a question, not a given. For 9 days, her life hung in the balance, judged not by love alone, but by a cold calculation of survival. She was one of the lucky ones. In the woods, not far from their farm, were places where other choices had been made. Everyone knew it, no one spoke of it. The wind howled, but now, inside the longhouse, a new life had a name. She was Asfrieder, and her struggle had just begun. Number 14 sickness was a spiritual failing, not just a physical one. It was the summer of 990 in Iceland. The days were long, the sun barely dipping below the horizon, but for 12-year-old Steinunn, the world was dark. She lay on a bed of hay and sheepskin in the corner of the longhouse, a fire burning in her. It had started with a cough a month ago. Now every breath was a painful effort. Her skin was hot to the touch, and she was often lost in a feverish haze. Her mother Gudrun did everything she knew. She brewed teas from yarrow and meadowsweet, herbs known to fight fevers. She placed cool, damp cloths on Steinunn's forehead. She made thin broths from bone and barley, trying to coax her daughter to eat. But the sickness had a deep hold. Steinunn grew thinner and weaker. The physical suffering was only part of the burden. In her community, a persistent illness was not just a matter of the body. It was seen as a weakness of spirit, a sign that something was wrong with your luck, your hamingja. A healthy, robust body was a sign of a strong spirit, of favor from the gods and the ancestors. Sickness suggested you were out of balance with the world, that your personal power was failing. Her neighbors would visit, their faces a mixture of concern and a subtle, fearful judgment. They would look at Steinunn wasting away on her bed and whisper among themselves. Had someone cast a curse? Had the family offended a local land spirit, a landvatir? Was there a draugr, one of the walking dead, haunting their farm and draining the life from the girl? The local wise woman, an old woman named Helga, was called. She was not a healer in the modern sense. She was a master of rituals and charms. She came into the longhouse, her eyes scanning every corner, looking for signs of ill will or dark magic. She examined Steinunn, not her body, but her aura, her presence. She ran her hands over the girl's shivering form, murmuring ancient chants. Helga declared that Steinunn's hugr, her soul or spirit, was wandering. It had become detached, perhaps frightened away by a shock or a dark influence. The sickness was the body's response to this spiritual absence. The cure was not in herbs alone, but in calling the soul back. So they performed a ritual. Gudrun and Helga sat by Steinunn's side all through the twilight night. Helga carved small protective runes on pieces of wood and placed them around the bed. She chanted, calling Steinunn's name, telling her spirit it was safe to return. She spoke of Steinunn's strengths, her skills at weaving, her quick smile. She was trying to remind the soul of what it belonged to. For Steinunn, drifting in and out of consciousness, it was terrifying. She felt the weight of her family's fear. She heard the whispers of the neighbors. She knew they saw her as unlucky as a weak link. It was a profound sense of shame and isolation. She was not just sick, she was failing. She was letting everyone down. She was a source of, bad luck for the entire farm. This psychological burden was as heavy as the fever. It made her feel alone, even in a crowded longhouse. She was fighting not just a disease in her lungs, but a battle for her very place in the world, a world that saw her suffering as a sign that she was no longer fit to be in it. Number 13, your play was practice for a life of labor or war. Finn was 7 years old. He lived in a settlement near what would one day be called Roskilde in Denmark around the year 950. His world was the farmstead, the woods, and the nearby fjord, and his world was filled with play. But his play was not idle. From the time he could walk, he had a knife. It was a small one, with a bone handle and a short iron blade, not much bigger than his finger. His father, Kettle, had made it for him. It was not a toy. It was a tool. His first lesson was how to use it without cutting himself. His second was how to carve. He spent hours with his older cousins, sitting outside the longhouse, carving chunks of scrap wood. They made horses, ships, and strange beasts from their imagination. But they were also learning the feel of the wood, the sharpness of the blade, the pressure needed for a clean cut. Their hands were learning a skill they would use for the rest of their lives to repair tools, build homes, or carve runes. His favorite game was war. He and the other boys had small wooden swords and round linden wood shields. They would divide into two groups and have mock battles in the fields. The older boys, 10 or 11, would lead the charges. They would practice shield wall formations, locking their wooden shields together, just as they had seen their fathers and uncles do. The thud of wood on wood echoed through the fields. These were not gentle games. They were rough. Bruises were common. A split lip or a bloody nose was a badge of honor. You learned not to cry. You learned to take a hit and get back up. You learned how to use the shield to block, how to find an opening, how to stand your ground. Their fathers would watch sometimes, shouting advice. Keep your shield up, Finn. Don't turn your back. This was not just a game, it was training. The skills they learned with wooden swords were the same skills they would one day need with iron ones. Raiding and warfare were parts of their world, and a boy had to be ready. His sister Runa, who was 5, played differently. Her games were also practice. She had a small clay doll and scraps of wool. She would spend hours with her mother and aunts at the loom. While the women wove large bolts of cloth, Runa would practice on a small, handheld loom, her small fingers clumsily working the threads. Her mother gave her a bone needle and taught her how to mend a tear in a tunic. Her play was about running a household. She helped grind grain with a small handstone. She learned to spin wool into thread with a drop spindle. She cared for her doll, wrapping it in cloth, putting it to sleep, feeding it imaginary food. She was practicing being a mother and the mistress of a farm. There was no clear line where play ended and work began. When Finn helped his father mend a fishing net, the rhythmic work was like a game. When Runa helped her mother prepare a meal, she was learning the properties of herbs and roots. The world did not grant them a separate time called childhood. Their entire youth was an apprenticeship for adulthood. Every game had a purpose. Every toy was a tool in miniature. The heartbreaking part was not the absence of play, but the relentless purpose behind it. There was no room for useless fun. Your value, even as a child, was measured by your potential utility. Your games were a constant, subtle reminder of the life of hard work and potential violence that waited for you. Number 12, you could be legally sold by your family. The year is 1010. In the bustling market of Hedeby, a major trading port in southern Jutland, a boy named Care stands silently beside a man he has only known for a month. Care is 9 years old. He is not here to buy anything. He is the one for sale. Care was not a captive from a foreign land. He was born a free Norseman in a small village several days' journey to the north, but his family's farm had failed. A blight had ruined their barley crop for 2 years straight. Their milk cow had died. The hunger in their longhouse had become a constant gnawing ache. His father, Thorir, had faced an impossible choice. He had 3 children. He could watch them all starve, or he could save some by sacrificing one. It was illegal and, in desperate times, accepted practice. The law codes, like the old Norwegian Gulating laws, had provisions for it. Of a father facing great need could sell his child into servitude or thraldom. It was a step above being an outlaw. It was a way to survive. The decision had shattered their family. Care remembered his mother's silent tears as she packed a small bundle for him, a spare tunic, and a small wooden horse he had carved. His father had not looked him in the eye. He had simply taken his hand and led him away. Thorir sold him to a traveling merchant named Bjarni for a sack of silver coins and some smoked fish. The price was low. A healthy adult thrall was worth far more, but a child was a risk. He had to be fed and housed for years before he could perform the hard labor of a man. Bjarni was taking a gamble. Now, in Hedeby, Care stood on a wooden platform. Bjarni was talking to another man, a wealthy landowner with a farm on the island of Funen. Bjarni was pointing out Kare's good points. He is strong for his age, his teeth are good, he does not complain. His care felt like a farm animal. He was being inspected. The landowner made him open his mouth, felt the muscles in his arms, and he was terrified. He did not know where he was going. He did not know if he would ever see his family again. He had lost everything, his home, his name's honor, his freedom. He was now a thrall, a piece of property. He could be bought and sold. His children, if he ever had any, would be born thralls. This was not the slavery of captured foreigners, though that was far more common. This was something different. This was the result of poverty reaching its most desperate point. It was the heartbreaking reality that a family's love could be overruled by starvation. Thorir had not sold his son because he did not love him. He had sold him in the desperate hope that Care would at least be fed, that he would live, and that the rest of the family might survive the winter. For Care, that reason did not matter. He was 9 years old, alone in a loud, strange city, and his life was no longer his own. A man he did not know paid Bjarni some silver, and Kare had a new master. He was led away from the market, not even daring to look back. For number 11, the loss of a parent meant the loss of your world. Solveig was 11 years old, living on a farmstead in the Orkney Islands around the year 920. Her life was defined by two people, her mother, Astrid, who taught her to spin, weave, and run the household, and her father, Magnus, a raider and a farmer who smelled of salt and iron. He was often gone during the summer months, but his return was always a time of feasting and stories. He was the center of their world, the source of their security and status. One autumn, he did not return. A single ship limped back into the harbor, its sail torn. The men who came ashore were grim-faced and injured. There had been a battle off the coast of Ireland. The raid had gone wrong. Magnus, they said, had fallen. The news shattered Solveig's world. The grief was a physical thing, a cold weight in her chest, but the consequences were immediate and practical. Magnus had been the chieftain, the head of the family. With him gone, their position was instantly precarious. His brother, her uncle Hakon, took over the farm. This was the custom, but Hakon had a wife and children of his own. Suddenly, Solveig and her mother were no longer the primary family in the longhouse. They were dependents. They moved from the warmest sleeping platform near the fire to a smaller, draftier one at the end of the hall. Their portion of food was smaller, their opinions were no longer sought. Astrid went from being the mistress of the household to a subordinate, taking orders from her sister-in-law. Solveig's future, which had seemed secure, was now uncertain. A marriage would have been arranged for her by her father, a match that would have benefited the family. Now her uncle Hakon would arrange it. He would likely seek a match that benefited his own sons, not her. She might be married off to a much older man or to someone of lower status simply to secure a minor alliance for Hakon. Her value had plummeted. She saw it in the way people treated her. The other children, who had once looked up to her as the chieftain's daughter, now treated her as just another cousin and not a favored one. She had lost more than a father. She had lost her identity. The law provided some protection. She and her mother were entitled to a share of Magnus's wealth, his movable property like silver and livestock. But the land, the source of all real power, passed to Hakon, and enforcing her claim to that wealth was difficult. It depended on the goodwill of her uncle, a man now more concerned with his own immediate family. Solveig had to grow up overnight. She worked harder than ever, trying to prove her worth, to make herself useful so she wouldn't be seen as a burden. The stories and songs she had loved now seemed like tales from another world. Her life was no longer about honor and adventure. It was about survival and securing a small, safe place in a world that had suddenly become hostile. The loss of her father was not just an emotional wound, it was a social and economic catastrophe from which she might never recover. Number 10, justice was a family matter, not a state one. Olaf was 14, but in the eyes of the law in, 10th century Iceland, he was on the cusp of manhood. At 15, he could be held fully accountable for his actions, but Something happened that forced that reality on him a year early. His older brother Gunnar was killed. It was not in a raid or a battle. It was a petty dispute over grazing land with a neighboring farmer named Skapti. Words had been exchanged at the Althing, the annual assembly. Tensions had simmered. One evening, Skapti and his cousins ambushed Gunnar on a path between farms. It was a short, brutal fight. Gunnar was left dead in the grass. There were no police to call. There was no king's authority to appeal to. In Iceland, justice was a private and family responsibility. The law did not punish criminals. It gave the wronged party the right to seek compensation or retribution. The family of the victim had two choices: seek a settlement of money, the Wergild or man money, or take revenge. Olaf's father, Eric, was old. His hands were gnarled with arthritis. He could no longer wield an axe with any real force. The duty, the terrible honor, fell to the next male in line. It fell to Olaf. The weight on the 14-year-old was immense. He was not a warrior. He was a boy who was good with sheep and knew the fishing grounds. He had never been in a real fight. But the honor of his family was at stake. If they accepted money for Gunnar's death without argument, they would be seen as weak. Other neighbors might try to take advantage of them. To do nothing was to invite further insult and injury. It was social suicide. The nights were the worst. Olaf would lie awake in the dark longhouse, listening to his mother's quiet sobbing. He could feel the eyes of the entire community on him. They were waiting to see what he would do. His cousins came to the farm, their faces hard. They spoke in low voices with his father, They were planning a revenge killing, and Olaf was expected to be part of it. He was terrified. He was afraid of dying. He was afraid of killing. Skapti was a grown man, a proven fighter. What chance did a boy have? But he was more afraid of the shame, of being called a coward, of letting his family down. A few weeks later, they acted Olaf. His two cousins and a farmhand went to Skapti's farm at dawn. Olaf's hands were sweating so much he could barely grip the handle of the small axe his father had given him. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was not a story or a saga, this was real. They caught Skapti as he came out to tend to his cattle. There was shouting, then the terrible sound of metal hitting bone. Olaf did not strike the killing blow. His cousin did, but he was there, he held his axe, he was part of the group. Under the law, he was just as responsible. They had restored their honor. Now, Skapti's family had the right to seek revenge on them. The cycle of violence had been reset, and Olaf was no longer just a boy. He was a killer, a man marked by blood. He had done his duty, but he had lost something profound in the process. He was 14 years old, and he was now part of a blood feud that could last for generations. That was the price of justice. Number 9, your home was a crowded, smoky, and public space. Thora was 8 years old. She lived on a large farm in the Mälaren Valley in Sweden around the year 900, and her home was a longhouse. From the outside, it was an impressive structure, over 60 feet long, with timber walls and a turf roof. But inside, it was not a private sanctuary. It was a single, long room, and it was always full of people. Thora lived there with her parents, her two younger brothers, her father's brother, and his family, her unmarried aunt, her grandfather, and 3 thralls who worked the farm. At any given time, there were more than 15 people living in that one room. There was no privacy, forever. At night, everyone slept on raised wooden platforms that ran along the 2 long walls. Families would have their own section, separated only by a hanging wool blanket or a wooden chest. And Thora could hear everything. She could hear her baby brother crying, her uncle snoring, the thralls muttering in their sleep. When her parents spoke, their words were never truly private. Every argument, every tender word, every plan was potentially overheard. The center of the longhouse was dominated by a long, stone-lined hearth. There were no chimneys, only a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. On calm days, the smoke hung in the air, stinging Thora's eyes and making her cough. The rafters were black with soot. The air always smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, cooking food, and damp wool. In the winter, when the animals were sometimes brought into one end of the longhouse to keep them from freezing, the smell was even worse. Light was scarce. The only light came from the smoke hole, the open doors at either end, and the flickering flames of the hearth. The corners of the longhouse were in perpetual gloom. It was a world of shadows and firelight. Life was lived publicly. Thora learned to weave by watching her mother and aunt at the loom, which sat in the main living space. She ate her meals of porridge and fish sitting on a stool by the fire, surrounded by everyone. When her father had a dispute with a neighbor, the man came into their home and they argued it out in front of the entire household. There were no separate rooms to retreat to, no personal space to call her own. Her whole life was on display. This constant togetherness had its comforts. She was never lonely. There was always someone to talk to, always something happening. It created a powerful sense of belonging, of being part of a large interconnected unit. But it was also stifling. She had no secrets. Her moods, her small successes, her childish mistakes were all observed and commented on by the group. The heartbreak of this reality was subtle. It was the lack of a quiet place to think. It was the inability to have a private thought or a moment of solitary peace. It was the constant wearing friction of living with so many people in such a small space. For a child, it meant growing up with the understanding that your life was not your own. It belonged to the family, to the household. You were a part of the whole, and the whole was always watching. Number 8, winter meant darkness, hunger, and isolation. The first snow came early that year in late October for 16-year-old Bjarni living on a remote farm in northern Norway around 890. It was a signal. The world was about to shrink. The Viking Age was a time of movement, of ships crossing the sea. But that was for summer. Winter was a different beast entirely. As the snows deepened, their farm became an island in a sea of white. The track that led to the next farmstead 5 miles away became impassable. The fjord, their highway to the wider world, froze over near the shore. For the next 5 or 6 months, their world would be the longhouse and the few outbuildings they could dig paths to. The darkness came first. The sun would rise late, a pale disk that skimmed the southern horizon for a few hours before sinking again. By mid-afternoon, it was dark. The long nights were broken only by the light of the fire and a few tallow lamps that gave off a greasy, flickering light. This perpetual twilight had a profound effect on everyone's mood. Tempers grew short, old grievances surfaced. The same faces, day after day, in the smoky gloom of the longhouse, could be grating. Then came the cold. It was a constant battle. The fire in the central hearth could never be allowed to die. Bjarni's main job was to ensure there was always a supply of wood or peat. He would spend hours in the biting wind, chopping wood they had gathered during the summer. Despite the fire, the corners of the longhouse were freezing. Waking up in the morning meant leaving the relative warmth of the fur blankets for the icy air, and then there was the hunger. Not necessarily starvation, but a gnawing, monotonous hunger. The summer's bounty was gone. The winter diet was what could be preserved. There was dried fish, salted meat, and tubs of skyr, a kind of sour yogurt. There was grain, mostly barley and oats, which they ground to make porridge and flatbread. Day after day, the meals were the same. The taste of salt and smoke was on everything. Fresh food was a distant memory. By late winter, the stores would be running low. Portions would get smaller. Bjarni's stomach often rumbled. He felt a constant lack of energy. Boredom was a constant enemy. There was work to be done mending tools, spinning wool, caring for the animals, but the days were long and repetitive. To pass the time, his grandfather would tell stories, the old sagas of gods and heroes. They would play board games like Nefertau, their carved whalebone pieces moving across the grid. These activities were a lifeline, a way to keep their minds sharp and their spirits from sinking into the gloom. The isolation was the hardest part. No new faces, no new stories from the outside world. They were completely on their own. If someone fell gravely ill, there was no one to call for. If a tool broke that they couldn't fix, it stayed broken. They had only themselves to rely on. This forged a powerful bond, but it was a bond born of necessity and confinement. For a young man like Bjarni, who had spent the summer fishing and dreaming of sailing on a real longship, the winter was a cage. It was a time of waiting, of enduring. It was a long, dark, hungry night that lasted for half a year. Number 7, your value was measured by your hands, not your mind. Ingrid was 10 years old, and her hands were never clean. They were the hands of a working woman, not a child. She lived in Jorvik, the Viking name for the city of York, in the year 975. The city was a crowded, muddy, bustling center of craft and trade, and from the moment she was old enough to follow instructions, Ingrid had been put to work. Her family were leather workers. Their small, timber-framed house was also their workshop. The smell of tanning hides, a sharp chemical tang, was the smell of her home. There was no school for a girl like Ingrid. Her education was in her hands. Her day started before dawn. Her first task was to fetch water from the communal well. The heavy wooden buckets made her arms and shoulders ache. Then she would help her mother prepare the morning meal, usually a simple oat porridge. After that, her real work began. She was not yet strong enough to work the large hides, but she had her own jobs. She was given the scraps and offcuts of leather. With a sharp awl and a leather cord, she would spend hours stitching. She made simple pouches, knife sheaths, and children's shoes. Her stitches were small and even. Her father had taught her, his large, scarred hands guiding her small ones. "Every stitch matters," he would say. "A weak seam makes a useless shoe." Her fingers were calloused. She had dozens of tiny white scars on her hands from slips of the awl or the needle. In the winter, the cold made her knuckles crack and bleed. There was no time to let them heal properly. She would just work through the pain. Her older brother Harold, who was 13, worked with their father, learning the more difficult tasks of cutting and treating the leather. His work was harder, but Ingrid's was more tedious. Stitching for hours on end, sitting on a low stool in the poorly lit workshop. She saw other children in the streets of Jorvik, the sons of wealthy merchants who did not seem to work. But for her and the children of the other artisans, the weavers, the blacksmiths, the potter's life was labor. Their worth to the family was not in their potential, but in their immediate contribution. Her small hands making a few extra shoes to sell at the market meant a little more food on the table. She did not learn to read or write. There was no need. The knowledge she required was in the feel of the leather, the tension of the thread, the rhythm of the work. Her mind was occupied with practical things, how much leather was needed for a shoe, how to make a knot that would not slip. The heartbreak was in this limitation. Her world was confined to the workshop, her future to more of the same. No one asked her what she dreamed of. No one considered that her mind might be capable of more than calculating the number of stitches in a seam. Her value was purely economic. She was a pair of hands. As she grew, she would be expected to marry another artisan, to have children, and to teach them the same skills, to turn their small hands into useful tools for the family trade. It was a life of purpose and skill, but it was a life chosen for her, defined not by her thoughts, but by the things her hands could make. Number 6, you were a legal adult at 12. At the great Althing in Iceland, the annual gathering held in the summer of 1005, a boy named Thorstein stood beside his father. He had just turned 12, and according to the Gragas, the Grey Goose laws that governed the Icelandic Commonwealth, he was no longer a child. He was now considered logmator or legally competent. This was not a celebration. It was a stark transition into a world of heavy responsibilities. On his 12th birthday, Thorstein had passed a threshold. He could now be a witness in legal cases. He could inherit property directly without a guardian. He could make oaths that were legally binding. But the new rights came with terrifying new liabilities. If he committed a crime, he could be prosecuted as an adult. If he injured another man, his family would have to pay the full compensation, just as if his father had done it. If he killed someone, even by accident, he could be declared an outlaw. An outlaw was a living ghost. To be declared an outlaw, or Skogarmadir, a forest man, was a sentence of social death. An outlaw had to leave their home and live in the wilderness. They had no rights. Anyone could kill them without penalty. In fact, Killing an outlaw was often rewarded, or it was the most feared punishment in Icelandic society. And now, at 12, Thorstein was subject to it. The weight of this new status settled on him. He had always been a boisterous boy, quick to get into scraps with his friends. Now, he had to think before he acted. A heated argument that ended with a punch was no longer a childish scuffle. It was an assault with legal consequences. His father, Grim, sat him down and explained it to him. Grim's face was serious. "You are a man now, in the eyes of the law," he said. "Your words have weight. Your actions have consequences. You represent this family. Do not bring shame or ruin upon us." The work he did on the farm also changed. Before he had helped, now he was expected to carry a full load. He was given responsibility for a flock of sheep in the high pastures, a task that required him to be away from the farm for days at a time, alone. He had to defend the flock from predators and be prepared for the sudden violent changes in the Icelandic weather. If he lost sheep through negligence, it was his fault, his economic loss. His relationship with the adults around him shifted. They spoke to him more directly without the gentle patience they afforded younger children. They expected him to understand complex discussions about farm management, inheritance law, and local politics. There was no ceremony, no rite of passage. It was simply a fact of the law, a line he had crossed by virtue of living for 12 years. The heartbreak was the abrupt end of childhood. One day he was a boy, allowed to make mistakes. The next he was a man with the full weight of the law, of honor, and of family survival resting on his young shoulders. He was still a child in his heart, but the world would no longer treat him as one. Number 5, dental health was a source of constant chronic pain. Her name was Sigrid, and she was 15. She lived near the shores of Lake Mälaren in Sweden in the late 10th century. By the standards of her time, she was a young woman, ready for marriage, but she lived with a secret, constant agony, the pain in her teeth. Archaeological evidence from thousands of Viking Age skeletons tells a clear story. While they did not suffer from cavities as much as modern people do due to their low-sugar diet, their teeth were subjected to incredible wear and tear. The stone querns used to grind grain for bread and porridge would inevitably leave tiny bits of grit in the flour. Over years of eating this gritty food, the enamel on their teeth was worn down, sometimes to the pulp. For Sigrid, this process had started years ago. The pain began as a dull ache, a sensitivity to the cold winter air. But now, several of her molars were worn almost flat. The nerves were exposed, every meal was an ordeal. Chewing tough, dried meat or hard, unleavened bread sent a jolt of sharp pain through her jaw. She learned to chew carefully on one side of her mouth. There were no dentists, there was no relief. A toothache was something to be endured. Sometimes her mother would give her a wad of willow bark to chew on. The bark contained salicylic acid, a natural painkiller, and it offered a small, temporary respite. But it could not fix the problem. The pain affected every part of her life. It made it hard to sleep. It made her irritable. It was a constant draining presence in the back of her mind. When the pain was bad, she could not focus on her weaving. Her hands would tremble. Eventually, the inevitable happened. One of her worn-down teeth became infected. An abscess formed at the root. The pain changed from a sharp, intermittent shock to a deep, throbbing, relentless force. Her cheeks swelled up. A fever started. This was now a life-threatening condition. An infection from a tooth could easily spread to the bloodstream, a condition we would now call sepsis. In the Viking Age, it was a death sentence. The family grew worried. They tried poultices of herbs on her cheek. A local woman known for healing charms came and chanted over her, trying to drive out the evil spirits that were causing the pain. Sigrid knew she was in serious trouble. The pain was unbearable, a white-hot fire in her head. She couldn't eat. She could barely drink. Her life at 15 was at risk, not from an axe or a storm at sea, but from a common, mundane problem inside her own mouth. The heartbreaking reality for so many Viking children and teenagers was this chronic, untreatable pain. Skeletons show evidence of abscesses, of teeth lost long before death, of jaws warped by infection. It was a silent epidemic of suffering. For Sigrid, the world was reduced to a single, consuming reality, the fire in her jaw, a fire that no one knew how to put out. Number 4, the gods were not comforters. They were powers to be appeased. Leif was 9 years old, and he was afraid of Thor. He did not fear him in the way a modern child might fear a monster under the bed. It was a deeper, more practical fear. Leif lived on the west coast of Norway around 960, in a village that depended on the sea. His father and older brothers were fishermen, and Thor was the god of thunder, storms, and the sky. The Viking gods were not benevolent, loving figures. They were powerful, capricious beings with their own agendas. They were not worshipped out of love, but out of a mixture of respect, awe, and fear. You did not pray to them for comfort. You made offerings to them to stay on their good side, to appease them, to bribe them into not destroying you. One afternoon, a sudden storm blew in from the sea. The sky turned a bruised purple-black. Thunder, which Leif's grandmother called Thor's chariot, rumbled across the water, shaking the longhouse. Leif knew his father and brothers were still out in their boat. He watched from the doorway as the waves grew into churning mountains of gray water. The wind screamed. His mother, her face tight with worry, took a small carved hammer pendant, a symbol of Thor, and rubbed it with fat from the cooking pot. She went outside into the teeth of the gale and placed it on a large rock facing the sea. She shouted an offering into the wind, promising Thor the best part of the catch if he let the boat return safely. This was not a quiet internal prayer. It was a transaction, a desperate bargain with a terrifyingly powerful deity. But Leif learned from this that the gods demanded payment. They were forces of nature personified. You could no more ask Odin for a hug than you could ask the winter for warmth. You dealt with them. When someone was sick, they might make an offering to Air, a goddess associated with healing. But if the person didn't get better, it wasn't because Air didn't care. It was because the offering wasn't good enough, or because the person's fate, their word, was already sealed. This concept of word was central to their worldview. Fate was a real, tangible force, a thread spun by the Norns at the moment of birth. Your destiny was predetermined. The gods themselves were subject to it. This created a sense of fatalism. Bravery was not about hoping for a good outcome. It was about facing your preordained fate with courage. For a child like Leif, this was a heavy psychological burden. There was no all-loving God to provide a sense of ultimate safety. The universe was a dangerous, unpredictable place, governed by powerful beings who were often hostile and, at best, indifferent. Your best hope was to be strong, clever, and lucky enough to navigate the dangers. If something terrible happened, if your father's boat was lost at sea, it was not a test of faith. It was just the storm, or Thor's anger, or simply your family's bad luck. It was your word. The heartbreaking part of this spiritual reality was the lack of comfort. It offered an explanation for the world's cruelty, but it did not offer solace. It taught children to be resilient and brave, but it also taught them that they were ultimately alone in a cold, magical, and dangerous world. When the storm finally passed, and Leif saw the small shape of his father's boat returning, his relief was not gratitude to a loving God. It was the simple, stark relief of having survived another encounter with the world's raw power. Number 3, your physical appearance could determine your fate. His name was Ulf, but the other children called him Ulf the Crooked. He was born with a twisted foot, what we would now call a clubfoot. He was 12 years old, living in a community in southern Sweden around the year 850. His foot meant he walked with a significant limp. He could not run as fast as the other boys. He could not stand for long periods without his leg aching. In the world of the Vikings, this was more than an inconvenience. It was a profound disadvantage that shaped his entire existence. Viking society placed an enormous value on physical prowess. A man's worth was often measured by his strength, his ability to work a farm, to row a boat, and to fight. A woman's worth was tied to her health and her ability to bear strong children. A strong, able body was a sign of good luck, of a strong Hamingja. A physical disability, on the other hand, was seen as a mark of ill fortune, a sign of weakness, not just of the body, but of the spirit. From his earliest years, Ulf was treated differently. While other boys were given small wooden swords and taught to fight, Ulf was often left to watch, where his father, a practical man, saw that Ulf would never be a warrior. He would be a liability in a shield wall. So his training was different. He was taught tasks that could be done sitting down. He became skilled at mending nets and carving wooden bowls, but these were seen as lesser tasks, not the work of a strong, honorable man. The social cruelty was constant. The nickname Ulf the Crooked was used by everyone, even adults. Nicknames based on physical characteristics were common and not always meant to be malicious, but for Ulf, it was a constant reminder of his otherness. He was defined by his disability. As he approached his teenage years, the consequences became even more stark. He knew it would be difficult for him to find a wife. A family would be reluctant to marry their daughter to a man who could not farm or fight effectively. He was seen as a poor provider, a weak link in the chain of kinship. His future was uncertain. He might end up as a dependent in his brother's household, never a master of his own farm. The heartbreaking reality was that his physical form overshadowed everything else about him. He was clever. He was a good storyteller. He was kind to the animals on the farm, but none of that mattered as much as his limping gait. In a society that valued strength and action above all, his body had failed him from birth. He was judged before he had a chance to prove himself. The sagas are full of heroes who are great warriors, but there are few heroes who are lame or weak. Ulf would never be the subject of a saga. His fate was to live in the shadow of his own physical imperfection, a constant visible symbol of the bad luck he was believed to carry. Number 2, your only education was for survival. Freya was 14, and she could read the world around her with expert precision. Living in central Jutland, Denmark, around the year 900, she could tell by the look of the clouds if a storm was coming. She knew which mushrooms in the forest were safe to eat, and which would cause a painful death. She could judge the health of a sheep by the color of its gums and the texture of its wool. She knew how to spin that wool into strong, even thread, how to dye it with woad for blue or onion skins for yellow, and how to weave it into warm, durable cloth. This was her education, and it was the only one she would ever have. There were no schools for children like Freya. The concept of a formal universal education did not exist. Knowledge was passed down directly from parent to child, from master to apprentice, and the curriculum was survival. She had never been taught to read or write runes. That was a specialized skill, usually for rune masters or chieftains who needed to commemorate a great event or mark a possession. For a farm girl, it was useless art. Her father could not read, her mother could not read. Words were spoken, stories were told, laws were memorized and recited, but the written word was not part of their daily life. Her education had been entirely practical, and it started as soon as she could walk. She learned by watching and doing. She followed her mother through the daily rhythm of household chores. She learned to cook, to preserve food for the winter, to make cheese and butter, to brew ale. She learned herbal medicine, which plants could soothe a fever, stop bleeding, or ease a stomachache. This was complex, vital knowledge, a science passed down through generations of women. Her brother, Eric, had a different education. He learned from his father how to plow a field with an ard, a simple scratch plow pulled by an ox. He learned how to read the seasons, to know when to plant the barley and when to harvest. He learned how to hunt, how to track a deer, and how to use every part of the animal, from the meat to the hide to the sinew. He learned how to fight, how to handle an axe and a shield, because their farm could be raided, and he had to be ready to defend it. This education was effective. It created competent, resilient adults who could survive in a harsh world. But it was also profoundly limiting. Freya's world was the farm. She knew every inch of it, but she knew almost nothing of the world beyond the next village. The stories the traders told were like fairy tales to her. She had no way to independently learn about history, geography, or different cultures. Her knowledge was deep, but it was also incredibly narrow. The heartbreak was in the lost potential. What if Freya had a mind for poetry? What if Eric had a talent for strategy? There was no system to discover or nurture these talents. Their minds were shaped and constrained by the immediate needs of their environment. Their education did not teach them how to think, it taught them how to do. It prepared them perfectly for the life they were born into, but it gave them no tools to imagine or create a different one. Number 1, you were not shielded from the brutality of life. Well, Solveig was 6 years old. It was a late autumn day in the year 930 on the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea. A trading ship, one her father had a share in, had just returned. The men were unloading the cargo. There were barrels of salt, fine wool from England, and other goods. There were also people, thralls, captives taken in a raid on the eastern Baltic coast. Solveig stood with the other children, watching. The thralls were being herded onto the shore. They were men and women, their clothes torn, their faces smudged with dirt and streaked with tears. They were tied together with ropes. One of the women was crying, a low, keening sound of pure despair. No one tried to hide this from Solveig. No one told her to go inside. This was simply a fact of life. This was how wealth was sometimes acquired. She saw the thralls being inspected by potential buyers, their mouths forced open to check their teeth, their arms felt for muscle. She saw a family being separated, a mother sold to one farmer, her teenage son to another. The sound of their cries was something she would never forget. This was her reality. Death, violence, and suffering were not abstract concepts. They were visible and frequent. When an animal was slaughtered for a feast, the children were there to watch. They learned how it was done, how the blood was drained and collected for puddings, how the animal was skinned and butchered. It was a practical lesson, not a traumatic event. It was where food came from when her elderly grandmother died one winter. Her body was not whisked away. She was laid out in the longhouse for several days. Family and neighbors came to pay their respects. Solveig saw her grandmother's still, cold face. She touched her hand. She was taught that death was a journey, a passage to another hall, and that it was a natural part of life, not something to be hidden or feared excessively. She saw the casual violence of the world, too. She saw her father return from a voyage with a long, ugly gash on his arm, a wound from a sword. He told the story of the fight as a point of pride. She saw arguments between neighbors that escalated to shoving and threats. She knew that a man's honor was a fragile thing, and that violence was an accepted way to defend it. The world did not try to preserve her innocence, because innocence was a liability. To survive, she needed to understand the world as it was a place of beauty and joy, but also of incredible hardness and cruelty. She needed to be tough. She needed to develop a resilience that would be seen as coldness by modern standards. The heartbreaking reality was this complete lack of a shield. Children saw things that would scar a modern child for life, but for them, it was just Tuesday. They saw human beings treated as property. They saw the unfiltered reality of death. They saw the results of violence firsthand. This early and constant exposure to the brutal mechanics of their world forced them to grow up incredibly fast. It forged them into hard people because, in their world, the soft did not survive. Solveig, at 6 years old, was already learning that lesson. She watched the thralls being led away, and she felt a confusing mix of pity and the simple, stark understanding that this was the way of things.